It was a bitter cold evening in December. The kind of cold that made your bones ache and your breath freeze in the air. But for little Jonah, none of that seemed to matter. His eyes were fixed on the bakery window in front of him, his breath fogging up the glass as he stared at the cakes inside. He was used to the cold by now, having spent the entire day on the streets, collecting bottles and cans just to make enough money for anything to make his mom's birthday special. His little sister Lucy was fast asleep on his back, wrapped in the old blanket he'd tied across his chest. She had been quiet for hours, exhausted from the cold and the long walk. Jonah had carried her like this since she could walk, and now at age 10 he still did, though the weight of her felt heavier than it used to. But today was different. It was his mom's birthday, and he wanted to make it special for her. If he could just find anything for her, he could bring a smile to her face. Jonah had saved up $462. It wasn't much, but it was all he could manage. And he hoped that maybe the bakery had something that no one else wanted. Maybe some leftover cake that was just going to get thrown away. That would be enough for her birthday. He stepped inside the warm bakery, the smell of vanilla and cinnamon filling the air, making his stomach growl. Lucy stirred against his back but didn't wake. Jonah could feel the warmth, the heat from the ovens and the people inside chatting. It was a stark contrast to the cold outside. He shifted uncomfortably, his thin jacket doing little to keep out the chill. His shoes, which had holes in them, squelched in the wet slush as he shuffled forward, trying to make himself as invisible as possible. The baker, a large man with a white apron, looked up from his counter, glancing at Jonah and Lucy. His eyes quickly assessed the boy, then his expression hardened. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice lacking any real warmth. Jonah cleared his throat. "Do you have any leftover cake? Anything from yesterday? Or the day before?" His voice was barely a whisper, barely audible over the chatter around them. The baker frowned, his arms crossing over his chest. "We don't give away our products," he said sharply. "If you want something, you pay for it like everyone else." Jonah's heart sank. He swallowed the lump in his throat, a knot of shame twisting in his stomach. He wasn't going to argue, though. He knew better. He turned slowly, his hand still gripping the crumpled bills in his palm, and started walking toward the door. But just as he reached for the handle, a deep voice called out from across the room. "Wait!" Jonah froze, his hand still on the door, his mind racing. He turned back and saw an older man rising from a corner table. He was tall, probably in his late 60s, with silver hair and a weathered face that seemed both kind and sad. He wore a dark overcoat and polished leather shoes, but it was his eyes that caught Jonah's attention. They were dark, tired, and held something Jonah couldn't quite place. "I'll pay for it," the man said. His voice was calm, steady, the kind of voice that people listened to without question. Jonah's heart raced, but he couldn't bring himself to speak. The man walked up to the counter, pulled out his wallet, and set a few bills on the counter. He looked at the baker and said, "Give him whatever's left." The baker hesitated, looking between the man and Jonah. Finally, with a sigh, he nodded. "Fine. 5 minutes," he muttered before walking to the back of the shop. Jonah just stood there, stunned, unable to believe what was happening. The man looked down at him, his eyes softening just a little. "Your mom's birthday, huh?" the man asked, his voice gentle. Jonah nodded, his throat tight. "Yeah," he whispered. "She's sick, she can't work. She always made me and Lucy a cake on our birthdays, even when we didn't have much. I wanted to do something nice for her." The man smiled, though it was bittersweet. "Sounds like you've been doing a lot already." Jonah shifted his weight, glancing at his sister, still sleeping peacefully on his back. "I just wanted to make it a little better for her, you know?" His voice trailed off, unsure of what else to say. The man's eyes softened even more. "I understand. I think I know exactly how you feel." Before Jonah could say anything else, the baker returned with a large cake box, white and adorned with silver ribbon. The cake inside was big, extravagant, almost too much for a simple birthday, but it was perfect. Jonah took the box, cradling it carefully against his chest, his heart pounding. The man gave him a small nod. "Happy birthday to your mom, Jonah. I hope she likes it." Jonah couldn't speak. The words caught in his throat, and he could feel the tears stinging his eyes, though he quickly blinked them away. He had never expected this. Not in a million years. A stranger had just done something for him and his family that he could never repay. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice trembling. The man nodded again and gave him a warm smile. "You don't have to thank me. Just take care of your mom and sister, that's enough." Jonah nodded, too emotional to speak. He turned toward the door, the box held tightly in his arms. He stepped out into the cold again, the snow falling heavier now, but somehow it didn't feel so cold anymore. The warmth from inside still lingered, and the weight of the cake in his hands felt like the weight of a miracle. As he walked down the street, he couldn't help but think about how one small act, one simple decision to see someone in need, had changed everything for him and his family. Maybe this was the start of something better, something he couldn't have imagined before. He looked down at Lucy, still asleep on his back, and smiled softly. "Mom's going to have a good birthday," he whispered. And for the first time in a long time, he believed it.
If you're enjoying this emotional journey, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a moment of this story. Drop a comment below to tell us where you're watching from and what part of the story moved you the most. Your support helps this channel grow, and we'd love to hear your thoughts. Let's share this story together.
Jonah opened the door quietly, but his mother, Carol, was already sitting up in bed, her tired eyes finding him the moment he stepped inside. The room was small, just big enough for a bed, a small table, and a few chairs. It wasn't much, but it was home. Jonah smiled softly. "Hey, Mom, I brought you something," he said as he set the cake box down gently on the table beside her bed. She looked at him, her face showing the wear of a long struggle, but her eyes still carried that warmth, that softness only a mother's gaze could possess. "You're home late, Jonah," she said, her voice weak but tender. "How was your day?" "It was fine," he replied, trying to keep his voice light. He didn't want to worry her. He knew she could tell when something was off, so he kept it simple. "I got you a cake," he added, pointing to the box on the table. "I didn't think we'd be able to afford one, but I found some extra money." Carol's eyes widened a little, and she let out a soft laugh, though it quickly turned into a cough. Her back still ached terribly, but she always tried to hide it from the kids. She knew they had enough to worry about. "A cake?" she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "Jonah, you shouldn't have. It's for your birthday, Mom," Jonah said, walking over to her bed. "I wanted to make it special." Carol's heart swelled with pride and love for her son. Despite all the struggles, Jonah always found a way to show her how much he cared. But there was something more in his eyes tonight, something more than the usual responsibility he carried. He had worked so hard for that money, carried his sister all day, just for a chance at something small but meaningful. Jonah opened the cake box slowly, his movements cautious, as though he was afraid to spoil the moment. Inside was a beautiful cake much too extravagant for them, but there it was, shining like a beacon of hope in the dim light of the room. He could feel his mother's gaze on him, watching him with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. "You really shouldn't have," she said softly, but Jonah could see the tears welling in her eyes. He knew his mother. She never asked for anything, never complained, but today her heart was full. Jonah smiled, his face glowing with a quiet pride. "It's not much, but it's something. I just wanted you to have it." Suddenly the door to the apartment opened behind them, and Edward Callahan stepped inside. Jonah turned in surprise, wondering why the man from the bakery had returned, but this time Edward was not alone. He was holding several bags, groceries, medicines, and a few other items that looked too expensive for them to ever afford. Edward had been at the bakery when Jonah asked for the expired cake, and now he stood in their doorway, looking less like a stranger and more like someone who belonged there. "Edward?" Carol's voice trembled as she looked at him in confusion. "What are you doing here?" Edward took a slow step inside, his eyes scanning the small apartment. "I came to make sure you're all right," he said, his tone calm but filled with an undeniable warmth. He looked at Jonah for a moment before turning back to Carol. "You've been through a lot, and I wanted to help. Your son told me about your situation, and I wanted to do more." Jonah, still holding the cake, watched the man carefully, unsure of what to make of this. He had never known kindness like this, especially not from a stranger. Edward was a wealthy man, but he didn't act like someone who had money. There was something about him, something sincere and raw that made Jonah trust him. "You don't have to do this," Carol said quietly, though she couldn't help the lump that formed in her throat. She was proud, and asking for help had always been hard. But right now, she was just too tired to fight the kindness being offered to her. Edward nodded gently, placing the bags on the table. "I want to help." "There's no shame in accepting kindness when it's offered." Jonah, who had been quiet, suddenly stepped forward, his small voice breaking the silence. "You don't have to do all this. I just wanted to get her a cake, that's all." Edward smiled at him, kneeling down so they were eye level. "Sometimes it's not about the cake, it's about showing up. And I think that's exactly what your mother has done her whole life. She's shown up for people who needed her. She deserves someone to show up for her too. Jonah's eyes widened as he took in the man's words. It was the first time anyone had said something like that to him, and it hit him harder than he expected. He looked down at the cake again, as if seeing it for the first time. It wasn't just a cake anymore. It was a symbol of something much larger. A symbol of the kindness they had been shown and the love that had surrounded them. Carol sat back against the bed, feeling the weight of her exhaustion finally begin to lift just a little. She hadn't expected any of this. She hadn't expected to be seen. But now with this stranger standing in her small apartment, offering help without hesitation, it felt like a miracle. Edward stood up, glancing at the bags he had brought with him. "I've also made arrangements for your medical care. You shouldn't be fighting this system alone," he said, his voice steady but filled with a quiet conviction. "I've contacted some people who can help you with the workers' compensation claim. We'll make sure you get the surgery you need." Carol's eyes met his. She didn't know what to say. It was all happening too fast. But there was something in Edward's voice that made her believe him. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to hope. "Thank you," she whispered, the words almost too heavy to say. But they carried the weight of years of struggle and sacrifice. "I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything," Edward replied. "I'm here. And I'll help as much as I can." Jonah stood still, taking it all in. He had always been the one taking care of his family, doing everything he could to hold it together, but tonight something had shifted. Tonight he was seeing something he never expected: kindness, generosity, and maybe, just maybe, a chance at a better life for his family.
If you're enjoying this emotional journey, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a moment of this story. Drop a comment below to tell us where you're watching from and what part of the story moved you the most. Your support helps this channel grow, and we'd love to hear your thoughts. Let's share this story together.
The days after Edward's visit felt strange. Carol felt like she was walking through a dream. The weight of the pain in her back was still there, but somehow it seemed more manageable now. Maybe it was the hope that had begun to seep in, tiny drops of it that she hadn't allowed herself to feel for months. Maybe it was the kindness of a stranger, someone who didn't owe her anything, that had decided to show up anyway. Whatever it was, things felt different now, even if just a little. Jonah couldn't stop thinking about Edward. He hadn't expected anyone like that to come into their lives. A rich man, sure. But this one had done more than just hand over a cake or groceries. Edward had made it clear that he wasn't just giving them handouts. He was offering something more, an opportunity to have a life that wasn't weighed down by endless struggles. But Carol, ever the realist, kept reminding herself that nothing was free. Edward's help might be genuine, but she couldn't let herself get too comfortable. The system had already failed her enough times. She wouldn't let her guard down too soon. That evening, after dinner, Jonah sat down at the table with his homework. Lucy was playing in the living room, humming to herself as she always did. The apartment was small, but it was theirs, and for the first time in a long while, Jonah felt like maybe, just maybe, it could be enough. Edward had left earlier that day after ensuring the groceries were put away, and Carol had everything she needed. He had promised to follow up on the workers' comp case and said he'd check in again soon. But Jonah knew something was different now. This wasn't just some charity. This was real help that might actually make a difference. Carol sat across from Jonah, her eyes thoughtful as she watched him work. It was rare that Jonah didn't try to make her feel better when she was down, but tonight she could see the quiet confidence in him that wasn't there before. "Jonah," she said softly, her voice cautious. "You know you don't have to carry everything on your shoulders, right? You don't have to keep trying to do everything for us." Jonah stopped writing and looked at her, his face serious. "I know, Mom," he said, his voice steady, though a little unsure. "But I want to. You've done so much for me and Lucy. I just want to make sure you're okay." Carol smiled gently, the kind of smile that only came after years of hard work and sacrifice. "I know you do, Jonah, but you're still a kid. You deserve to have a childhood, too." "I'm going to get better, I promise. You don't have to be the adult here." Jonah frowned, shaking his head. "But I am, Mom. I'm the only one who can be. I have to do this. I need to make sure we're okay." Carol's heart ached as she listened to him. She knew what he was trying to say, but hearing it from him made it clear just how much weight he had been carrying for far too long. "I know, sweetheart," she said softly, her voice catching in her throat. "But you can't do it all alone. You don't have to." Jonah looked at her, his young eyes filled with uncertainty. I don't know how to stop. There was a long pause as Carol looked at her son, the boy who had carried more than any child should have to carry. She stood up slowly, walking over to where he was sitting. She knelt beside him and put a hand on his shoulder. You don't have to stop, Jonah. You just need to let other people help too. You've done enough. You've given us more than I could ever ask for. Let someone else help now, okay? Jonah looked up at her, his expression softening. For the first time in a while, he allowed himself to believe that it might be okay to let go of some of the responsibility. That maybe, just maybe, it was okay to let someone else step in and help him carry the load. Later that evening, just as they were finishing dinner, there was a knock at the door. Jonah opened it cautiously, his hand resting on the doorknob, half expecting someone from the building to complain about the noise. But when he opened the door, he was surprised to find Edward standing there, his smile as warm as ever. I hope I'm not interrupting, Edward said, his voice calm but carrying a note of urgency. I just wanted to check in on you and Carol. How are things? Carol walked over to the door, surprised to see him back so soon. Edward, she said softly. We're fine, thank you. You didn't have to come back so soon. I know, Edward replied, but I wanted to make sure you were doing okay. And I have something for you. Jonah stepped aside to let Edward in, his curiosity piqued. Edward handed over another large bag, filled with more groceries. This time, there were fresh fruits, vegetables, and something that made Jonah's heart leap, his mother's favorite tea. Edward smiled at Jonah's surprised expression. You mentioned your mother liked this tea, so I thought I'd bring her some. It's the least I could do after all she's done for so many others. Carol smiled, her eyes filling with tears, but she held them back. Thank you, she said quietly, taking the bag from him. This means more than you know. Edward nodded, watching her carefully. I'm just doing what I can. No one should have to go through this alone. And you don't have to. Jonah stood back, watching Edward and his mother. The connection between them felt different now. There was something deeper there, something more than just a random act of kindness. Edward wasn't just a stranger anymore. He was someone who had genuinely cared enough to help without asking for anything in return. I appreciate it, Carol said, her voice steady but filled with gratitude. I truly do. Edward looked at Jonah for a moment before speaking again. You're not alone, you know. You've got more people who care about you than you think. And I'll keep helping as much as I can. Jonah smiled, a small, hopeful smile. For the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope for what the future could hold not just for him, but for his family. Edward stayed for a while, talking with Carol and Jonah, making sure everything was in order. Before he left, he told them both something that stuck with Jonah long after he'd gone. When you help someone, you don't just change their life. You change yours too. And that's the real gift. As Edward walked out into the cold night, Jonah stood at the door, watching him go. Something in him had shifted. Maybe it was the thought of people actually caring, or maybe it was the realization that he didn't have to carry everything alone anymore. He closed the door softly and turned back to his mother. I think everything's going to be okay now. Carol looked at him, a soft smile on her lips. Yes, Jonah, I think it will be. The days after Edward's visit left Jonah with a mix of emotions. The warmth from the bakery, from Edward's kindness, still lingered, but something else had begun to creep in doubt. It wasn't that he didn't appreciate everything Edward had done, but Jonah had never learned to rely on others. He had always been the one who made things work, the one who carried the burden of his family's survival on his small shoulders. It was hard to accept help. Harder still was the growing sense that there was something more to Edward's visits than what was being said. Every time Edward left, Jonah felt like there was something left unsaid. Something in the way Edward looked at him, or the way his eyes lingered on his mother when she wasn't looking. That evening, after dinner, Jonah sat in the small living room, his homework pushed aside. His eyes were fixed on the window, watching the snow fall gently outside. The silence in the apartment was comfortable, but it felt like a weight on his chest. It was the kind of quiet that made him realize just how much he missed how much they had all missed, for so long. Carol was in her room, resting. Her back was still bothering her, but there was a quiet strength in her, a determination to keep pushing forward. Jonah admired her for that, but it also made him feel small, as if his own strength would never be enough to match hers. Then there was Edward. The man had been so generous, so selfless, but Jonah couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Edward was wealthy, but he never spoke of his money. He never spoke of his life outside of their small apartment. And yet, he seemed so eager to help. Jonah couldn't understand it. Why would someone with so much to give care so much for them? He was pulled from his thoughts when he heard the knock at the door. Jonah's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't expecting anyone, and the knock sounded different than the usual random visitors or bill collectors. He hesitated for a moment before standing up and walking to the door. When he opened it, there stood Edward, his hands in his pockets, his face unreadable. "Evening, Jonah," Edward said, his voice steady but quieter than usual. "Evening, Mr. Callahan," Jonah replied, his heart pounding. "What's up?" Edward's eyes flickered to Jonah before he spoke again. "Can I come in for a minute?" Jonah stepped aside without saying anything, watching as Edward entered, his presence suddenly making the small apartment feel even smaller. The man's suit seemed out of place in the cramped space, his polished shoes clicking softly against the floor. I just wanted to check on you and your mom," Edward said, glancing at the small table where they usually ate. "How's she doing?" Jonah wasn't sure how to answer. Carol had been quieter lately, less able to hide the pain in her back. She tried not to let it show, but Jonah could tell. Still, he didn't want to burden Edward with their problems. The man had done enough already. "She's okay, she's trying to rest," Jonah replied, his eyes not quite meeting Edward's. Edward nodded, but Jonah noticed a shift in his demeanor. He seemed distant, almost as if he were holding something back. The brief pause that followed made Jonah uneasy. "I also wanted to talk to you about something," Edward said, his voice lower now. "About your mother, about why I'm helping." Jonah froze. This was it, the thing that had been eating away at him. He had known something was off, something he couldn't quite grasp. Was there a catch? Was there something he didn't understand about Edward's kindness? "I don't expect anything in return," Edward continued, his tone calm but serious. "But I know what it's like to lose someone, and I know what it's like to watch someone you care about suffer without being able to do anything about it. I've been there." Jonah blinked, his confusion deepening. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I mean, you've been helping us, but I don't understand why." Edward's eyes softened, and for the first time, Jonah saw something different in the man, something more human. Edward took a slow breath and looked at Jonah, his gaze heavy with unspoken truth. "It's personal," Edward said, his voice thick with emotion. "When my wife was sick, I spent years watching her fight, trying everything to keep her alive. I was a doctor, but I couldn't save her. And the whole time I kept thinking I was doing everything right, but I wasn't seeing her. I wasn't really seeing her until it was too late." Jonah felt a tightness in his chest as Edward's words sank in. There was a rawness in his voice that Jonah hadn't expected. Edward wasn't just some rich man throwing money around. He had suffered too. He had experienced loss just like Jonah's family had. The man's grief wasn't something that could be fixed with money. It was something deeper. "I guess what I'm trying to say is that I see you, Jonah," Edward continued, his voice quieter now. "I see you, and I see your mother. I see the weight you're carrying. I see how hard you've been trying to make everything work. I've been there." Jonah swallowed hard, his throat tight. He hadn't expected this, hadn't expected the conversation to turn this way, but now that it had, he couldn't look away. "You don't have to do this," Jonah said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to keep helping us." Edward's gaze softened, and he stepped closer. "Yes, I do, because I know what it's like to feel invisible, and I don't want you to feel that way anymore." For the first time, Jonah felt something shift inside him. Edward wasn't just a stranger. He was someone who understood. And for reasons Jonah didn't fully understand yet, Edward had decided to help them, not out of pity or obligation, but out of a deep, personal understanding of what it meant to suffer, to struggle, and to survive. "I don't know what to say," Jonah whispered, his eyes downcast. I never thought anyone would care enough to help." Edward reached out, resting a hand on Jonah's shoulder. "I care. And so does your mother. You're not alone in this." Jonah looked up at Edward, his heart swelling with a mixture of gratitude and something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Just as Jonah opened his mouth to respond, there was a soft sound from the back bedroom. It was Carol, her voice weak but steady. "Jonah?" She called softly. "Who's here?" Jonah glanced back at Edward, unsure what to say. He didn't want to overwhelm his mother. But Edward's reassuring smile gave him the courage he needed. "It's okay, Mom. It's Edward. He's here to help." As Jonah walked toward the bedroom, he felt the weight of the world shift slightly. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he had to carry it alone. The weeks that followed Edward's quiet confession brought with them a sense of unease and unexpected relief. Jonah found himself caught between two worlds. The one where he had to keep everything together, and the one where, for the first time, someone was offering to share the load. Edward's presence had become a steady thread woven into their lives, though it wasn't always easy for Jonah to accept. He had grown used to being the protector, the one who made sure his mother and sister had everything they needed, even when it meant sacrificing his own peace of mind. But now, with Edward's help, something inside Jonah began to shift. It was a Saturday morning when Carol received a phone call that would change everything. Jonah was sitting at the kitchen table, his homework spread out in front of him, but his mind was elsewhere. The sound of the phone ringing echoed in the small apartment, and Carol, looking a little too pale, answered it in the other room. Jonah could hear her muffled voice as she spoke, though he couldn't make out the words. He heard her mention her injury, the surgery, and then there was a long silence. His heart skipped a beat. He didn't know if it was hope or dread tightening in his chest. He stood up slowly, unsure whether to interrupt or stay out of it. His mother's voice came back to him, softer now. "Wait, you're sure?" Carol asked, and Jonah could hear the tremble in her tone. "Are you certain about this?" Jonah's feet moved before he could stop them. He walked toward the hallway, his mind racing with the questions he hadn't yet asked. When he reached the doorframe of the living room, Carol was holding the receiver tightly, her face a mixture of disbelief and cautious hope. "Mom?" Jonah asked softly, his voice tentative. Carol looked up at him, her eyes wide with surprise, and then a flood of emotions poured over her. She didn't speak immediately. She just placed the phone down slowly and took a deep breath, as if trying to steady herself. "Mom?" Jonah repeated, his heart hammering in his chest. Carol's hands were shaking. She wiped a tear from her cheek, though she tried to hide it, and she gave him a small, nervous smile. It's the hospital," she said, her voice unsteady. "They've approved my surgery. They're going to fix my back." Jonah froze in place, the weight of the words not sinking in right away. He stood there, watching his mother, his breath caught in his throat. For so long, they had been trapped in a cycle of denial, paperwork, and constant struggle. There had been so many setbacks, so many times she'd had to just wait for answers that never came. But now it was real. The hospital was going to do something about it. They were going to help her. Jonah felt his chest tighten as tears threatened to fill his eyes. He hadn't realized how much he had been holding back until this moment. His mother was finally going to be able to walk again, to feel relief, to move without pain. It was something he had dared not dream of for so long. Carol's eyes softened as she saw the raw emotion on Jonah's face. She reached out and pulled him into a tight hug. "I couldn't have done this without you, Jonah," she whispered, her voice thick with gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done." Jonah clung to her, holding on tightly, as if afraid this good news might slip away, like so many other fleeting moments in their lives. He wasn't sure what to say, but he knew that this moment where his mother's health was finally getting the care she needed, was more than just a victory for her. It was a victory for him, too. For all of them. "I'm just happy it's finally happening," Jonah said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "You don't have to carry all of it anymore, Mom." Carol pulled back slightly, looking at him with a soft smile, but her eyes were still filled with unshed tears. "Neither do you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're not alone anymore, Jonah. You never have been." "I see that now." As if on cue, there was a knock at the door again, and Jonah couldn't help but smile as he turned to answer it. This time, when he opened the door, there was Edward, standing with his usual calm but with something different in his eyes, something that said he was part of this family too. He had become more than a stranger offering help. He had become someone they could rely on, someone who had seen the need and answered it without question. "You're going to be okay, Carol," Edward said softly, stepping inside and looking between the two of them. "And Jonah, you're going to be okay too." Jonah smiled, his heart swelling with a mixture of relief and warmth. The tension that had been weighing on him for so long had finally begun to ease. Maybe this was the beginning of something better, something they could all count on. "Thank you, Edward," Carol said, her voice sincere. "I don't know how to thank you for all you've done." "You don't need to," Edward replied, giving her a reassuring smile. "This is what family does. We help each other." Jonah felt the weight of the moment sink in. It wasn't just about the surgery, or the money, or even the help they'd received. It was about the connections they had made, the relationships that had been forged through their struggles. Edward wasn't just a benefactor. He was a friend. He was someone who had seen them when others had turned away, someone who had stepped in when they needed it the most. "Family," Jonah echoed softly, looking up at both Edward and his mother. "Yeah. I think you're right." And for the first time in a long while, Jonah felt like he wasn't alone anymore. He wasn't carrying everything on his own. There were people in his life now who would stand by him, who would stand by his family, no matter what came next. The days following the news of Carol's surgery approval passed in a blur, but there was something different in the air. It wasn't just the relief of knowing that Carol would finally receive the treatment she so desperately needed. It wasn't just the promise of a new beginning, of hope that had been distant for so long. No, this was something deeper. It was a quiet certainty that things were changing, not just in their circumstances, but in themselves. Jonah watched his mother with a new sense of awe. She was still the same strong woman, the one who had always been there for him, but now there was something softer in her eyes. Maybe it was the acknowledgement that help had finally arrived, or maybe it was the realization that she didn't have to do everything alone anymore. Whatever it was, it made Jonah feel like the weight he had carried on his shoulders for so long was beginning to lighten, piece by piece. Edward's presence had become a steady support for them both. He didn't push, didn't demand anything in return. He was there when they needed him, offering quiet encouragement, making sure Carol had everything she needed to prepare for her surgery. It wasn't just the help with bills or legal matters, it was the small things, the constant, thoughtful acts that made all the difference. He was becoming a part of their family in a way Jonah never expected, and the more Jonah thought about it, the more he realized that this unexpected kindness had changed everything for them. It wasn't just about a cake. It wasn't just about the groceries or the legal battles. It was about showing up, about being seen and heard in a world that often ignored the quiet struggles of people like them. Jonah had learned something powerful through all of this. The smallest act of kindness can spark a chain of events that changes everything. And that kindness didn't just come from Edward, it came from everyone who decided to stop and notice, to offer help, even when they didn't have to. The night before Carol's surgery, they sat together in the small kitchen, eating dinner by the light of a single lamp. It was simple food, nothing fancy, but it felt like the most meaningful meal they had shared in a long time. Jonah could see it in his mother's face. The relief, the exhaustion, but also something else, a piece that had been absent for so long. Jonah looked up from his plate, his heart full. "Tomorrow," he said quietly. "Tomorrow's the day." Carol smiled softly, her eyes meeting his. "Yes, Jonah, tomorrow's the day. And it's a new day for all of us." Edward, who had quietly joined them at the table, nodded in agreement. "It's the beginning of something better," he said, his voice steady. "Sometimes the hardest times lead us to the best things." Jonah thought about that. He thought about everything they had been through, all the struggles, the uncertainty, and the heartache. But he also thought about the kindness that had pulled them through. The love and generosity that had come from unexpected places. The strength that had been there all along, even when they didn't know it. "Thank you," Jonah said, his voice filled with gratitude as he looked at Edward. "For everything." "I don't know where we'd be without you." Edward gave him a warm, reassuring smile. "You don't have to thank me, Jonah. This is what it means to be a part of something bigger than yourself. It's about taking care of one another. No one should ever have to go through this alone." Carol placed her hand gently on Jonah's. "We've learned a lot through all of this. About asking for help, about accepting kindness, and about never giving up no matter how hard things get." Jonah smiled, his heart swelling with a quiet hope. He had learned so much in such a short time, lessons about the power of kindness, the importance of family, and the strength that came from letting others in. He didn't have to do it all by himself anymore, and that realization felt like a weight lifting from his chest. As they finished their meal, Carol turned to Edward once more. "I don't know what the future holds," she said, her voice soft but steady. "But for the first time in a long while, I feel like I can breathe. Like there's hope." Edward smiled, standing up from the table, and that's all anyone can ask for. A chance to hope, to heal, and to move forward. The next morning, Carol went into surgery, and Jonah sat by her side, holding her hand, as the doctors did what they had promised. As the hours passed, Jonah felt a quiet sense of peace, knowing that this was the first step in a new chapter for them all. A chapter that was built not just on their struggles, but on the kindness and strength they had found in each other. Kindness is transformative. The small acts of kindness that Edward showed to Jonah and Carol weren't just about helping with practical things. They were about offering hope when it was needed most. You don't have to carry the burden alone. Sometimes, the most difficult thing is allowing others to help. But when we do, we open the door to healing, connection, and growth. Hope is a choice. No matter how hard things get, we always have the power to choose hope and the courage to keep going. The darkest moments often lead to the brightest opportunities. As you reflect on this story, Remember that kindness matters, that hope is never lost, and that no one is truly alone. The world might feel heavy at times, but even in the smallest moments, there are opportunities to lift each other up. So when you see someone who needs something, don't turn away, be the one to show up, just as someone did for Jonah and his family. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories that remind us of what truly matters. Hit that notification bell so you won't miss the next uplifting tale. And we'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from? And what did you think about this story? Share your thoughts in the comments below and help support the channel's growth. Remember, giving up is never an option. Let's keep going together, with hope and kindness leading the way.